Hello and welcome to At the Heart of Health with Dr. James Marcum. In today's well-marketed world, it's hard to know who or even what to believe when it comes to health care. In each program, Dr. Marcum, a board-certified behavioral cardiologist, takes a balanced approach using common sense modern medicine and the ultimate source of truth, the Bible, recognizing that at the heart of health is love.
At the Heart of Health is a unique health program in this well-marketed world. Why are we unique? For a couple reasons. One, we're not trying to sell a product. Two, it's not about a person, but it's about a message. And what is that message? Well, that message is the truth found in the Bible. The Bible has truth in this owner's manual that change our chemistry. And if you think about it, as we change the way we live, as we violate the owner's manual, guess what happens? Our chemistries change. We move away to how we were originally designed. Today we have with us a healer, Steve Gallimore. And Steve, I want to welcome you. And first, when I say healer, everyone...
I've never been introduced that way before.
No, but as a healer, everyone has the ability to heal.
Right.
For instance, you make someone laugh, you change their chemistry. One of our mottos this year for this program is at the heart of health is love. And love is one of the unique healing forces we have in the universe.
Right.
And part of the problem we're getting into now is we don't have love in our lives, our chemistry is damaged, stress is put on the system. So we're going to talk today about how the spiritual life and the physical life are intertwined. And I'm just thinking right now, we've got a couple questions here that have come into Heartwise Ministries, and one of them has to do with how is our physical life and our spiritual life intertwined? And I think a unique place to start would be a doctor in the Bible who knows a little bit about the physical side of healing, and that's Luke.
Well, yes, when you mention Luke, of course, he is so unique and so different. That doesn't mean that the rest of the Bible isn't great. The other Gospels, are not superb and meet a need. But Luke is really unique because he is the only non-Jewish writer in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And he came from an entirely different perspective. You know, Peter, of course, and some of his friends were fishermen. But here we see Luke is a well-trained physician, trained in the arts of Greek healing. Mm-hmm. And the Greeks, of course, were very well, I mean, these were studious people.
They were on top of it.
And so Luke was a well-trained person. He was a person of intellect, and it comes through in his writing. But that's not what is so impressive about Luke. What really is impressive about Luke is that he saw through the physician's eyes the need of humanity. And that cuts across all different kinds of spectrums. Mm-hmm. He saw the need of people that carried loads of guilt. He saw the need of people that were suffering physically. He saw the needs of people that had emotional difficulties. And we find all of this in the Gospel of Luke. And so we find a lot of stories in the Gospel of Luke that we don't find in the other Gospels.
And you know what's neat about this is just think Luke was actually a doctor that gave up his healing practice in modern medicine to move to another type of healing that also changed the chemistry of the Bible.
Well, you know, Jim, I have often thought about this. And here is Luke, a physician, mm-hmm. and he followed the great physician. And I just have wondered at times about Luke. I mean, think of that picture for just a moment. Here was Luke, an accomplished, well-trained physician.
He probably had a booming practice.
He probably had a great practice. And he followed Jesus, and he watched Jesus now accomplish things that all of his medical science just could not get anything done. I mean, we have the same thing today. As great as medical science is, there are so many things that simply cannot get accomplished. And Luke must have watched that over and over again. When he would see people that he couldn't treat, he knew that he did not have the remedy for what was their problem and what was ailing them, and yet Jesus could meet their need.
You know, he was looking for what we're all looking for, ultimate healing.
Right.
And I can't tell you how many times, Steve, when someone's riddled with cancer or they have an inoperable disease, and you tell them that we can't cure you, but there is a healing power that will heal you someday. And that's a remarkable promise and a remarkable treatment to give to any person.
Right.
Now, some of the stories in Luke, let's talk about some of those neat stories that Luke has.
Well, you know, there are so many of them because Luke, we talk about the synoptic gospels, and John kind of sits out by itself to the side. But really, the Gospel of Luke isn't quite like Matthew and Mark. It is a different gospel as well. And so we find a number of these stories where he focuses in on meeting human need. But let me just mention, first of all, some of the unique aspects of Luke. We have these stories, a number of these stories that are told. But we also find in Luke a lot of praise that we don't find in the other Gospels.
Wow.
Luke is permeated with praise. Now, here you think of a physician that sees people suffering and so forth. You know, you might think that, well, Luke would write sort of a downcast gospel. You know, while the world is overrun with suffering and so, but Luke is full of praise. It's not just focused on what's going to happen in the future. We find praise all through the Gospel of Luke about what happens now.
Wow.
We also find that Luke had a heart for those that were outcast in society. For instance, the Samaritans of the day of Christ. Luke was a non-Jew, and we see a lot in his writing about the non-Jews of that region, the Samaritan people. We find him with a real heart for those that were sinners, those that were not respected by society for their ethical righteousness. We see a real heart in Luke for women, which is totally different than the other Gospels, because women were the outcasts of society as well. In fact, the Jewish male in the time of Christ would get up every morning and he would say, Lord, I am so thankful that I'm not a Samaritan. I am so thankful, you know, that I'm not a woman or a slave. That was the prayer that a Jewish man would pray in the morning. Can you imagine women listening to that prayer?
Man, no, I can.
And here Luke comes back now, and Luke tells the stories of Jesus reaching out in a sympathetic way, in an understanding way to the women of that society. So all across the board, we find that Luke has this tender heart. Therefore, we find that the story of the Good Samaritan only in the Gospel of Luke. We find the story of the widow of Nain only in the Gospel of Luke. We find the story of the prodigal son only in the Gospel of Luke. There are a number of others as well, but those are some unique characteristics, and those are some stories that we find Luke telling that we don't find in the other Gospels, just because it comes from the perspective of a physician that held in tender regard all of humanity, and he picked up on those things in the life and the teachings of Christ that reflected that and recorded those in his gospel.
Wow, I think Luke definitely lets us know how our spiritual lives and physical lives go together. In these stories, he shows us that love, they wanted something more. They wanted something more than the technology of the day, the pills of the day, the salves of the day. There was more to healing than that.
Well, without doubt. And, you know, Jim, you mentioned just a moment ago that you're looking at love. We find this principle in the Gospel of Luke. Yes, Luke was a physician. Yes, Luke was well trained, and no doubt when you know, later on as time went on, Luke continued to practice his work. But at the same time, he also recorded these wonderful miracles of Christ, saying there's more. There's more today that goes beyond modern medicine, because we do have a God that loves and cares, and that realizes that healing is more than just mixing up, you know, some concoctions. I'm using that in a positive way, but, you know, mixing up medicines and to the best of, you know, the ability of science of his day. It's more than that. It's having love, and it's having forgiveness, and all of those things that bring healing in addition to what the physical physician can do to meet those physical needs.
And now modern medicine is showing us, there's scientific studies that have shown that when there's love in a life, we've learned about dogs and cats and animals. People that have those have less heart attacks, less strokes, less infections. They do better with cancer. Well, it's not anything about the you know, it's not anything about the barking. It's the love that's exchanged between. God made us to love. Now, this world, if I was an evil one that wanted to cause disease in this world, I would remove love.
Right.
And that would have all that stress and the chemistry that goes with it. So I think Luke was figuring things out.
Well, without doubt, one really moving story that's unique to Luke that we haven't mentioned is the woman that was at Simon's house. And as you know, she had a reputation of being a woman that lived an immoral life. And now she comes in and she, of course, cries over the feet of Christ and so forth, and a lot of criticism. Now, Simon had gathered together all of these people. He was a teacher, a rabbi. It wasn't uncommon for people to come into his home. He probably had a large home with an open center courtyard. People would come in. He would serve a meal. These people were all gathered around, his friends and so forth. And this woman comes in. And, of course, all the people around the table are murmuring about this woman being there. And, you know, Simon thinking, well, if this man really was a prophet, he'd know what kind of woman this was, and he'd put her in her place. He'd take care of this issue. Instead, Jesus, of course, turns this in the story as Luke tells it. He turns it back on Simon. And he says, Simon, the problem is not with this woman, because her heart is full of love, and she has expressed that to the best of her ability in a right kind of way here today. On the other hand, you haven't given me, you know, the time of day, so to speak. Simon, you brought me in here. This whole atmosphere is an atmosphere of heaviness and of criticism. And in this woman, Simon, is someone whose heart is really right with God. Right. And you can imagine then how that woman must have felt. And as Jesus lifted that load of guilt and anxiety that rested on that group because of this critical Pharisee and others that were gathered, the other critical Pharisees. But we see Jesus now saying, listen, love and forgiveness go together, and it's a healing part of life.
Well, Luke certainly understood that the modern medicine of his day wasn't enough. And I would challenge our listeners out there that the modern medicines of our day is not enough. Not that we don't use those for healing, but there's something more, a higher healing that we must alert the world to. We're going to continue this discussion in just a few moments with Steve Gallimore. Stay with us.